No one inside that dojo expected history to unfold that day. Not the students stretching on the mats, not the instructors correcting stances, and certainly not the man who smiled first. Arnold Schwarzenegger stood near the edge of the training floor, relaxed, confident, watching quietly. Across from him was Chuck Norris, calm, focused, moving with the kind of control that doesn't seek attention, but commands it anyway. The room felt normal, peaceful, predictable. Then Arnold smiled. It wasn't arrogant. It wasn't disrespectful. It was the kind of smile that comes from curiosity. The look of someone who has spent a lifetime mastering strength and now wants to understand something deeper. A few students noticed. Simonin stopped tying their belt. Another slowed their breathing, because when two legends share a moment like that, people feel it, even if they don't know why. 7 seconds later, the dojo went silent. Not the awkward kind of silence, not fear, but the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they're about to witness something real, something unscripted, something honest. No cameras were rolling. No crowd was cheering. No one was trying to prove anything, and that's what made it powerful. This wasn't about muscles versus technique. It wasn't about fame or reputation. It was about controlled discipline and respect between two men who understood what true mastery actually means. Some moments announce themselves with noise. Others arrive quietly and stay with you forever. This was the second kind. Have you ever seen a moment where two masters meet, and you can't tell who's about to learn more? The dojo carried a quiet kind of energy, the kind that comes from discipline, not noise. Wooden floors polished smooth from years of training reflected the overhead lights. White mats lay perfectly aligned, their edges straight, untouched by chaos. The air smelled faintly of sweat, effort, and clean cotton uniforms. Students moved in steady rhythm. One pair practiced slow, deliberate strikes. Another worked through footwork, correcting balance with each step. An instructor walked calmly between them, offering short corrections, never raising his voice. This was not a place for showing off. It was a place for learning. Arnold Schwarzenegger stood off to the side, observing. He wasn't trying to draw attention. No flexed arms, no performance. Just quiet confidence. The kind that comes from years of discipline in a different arena. His posture was relaxed, but alert. He watched the movements on the mat the way a craftsman studies another craft. Across the room, Chuck Norris moved with almost no sound. His steps were light, his posture upright. Every movement looked simple, but precise. When he demonstrated a technique, he didn't exaggerate it. No flair. No wasted motion. The students watched closely, not because they were told to, but because something about his presence demanded focus. Chuck corrected a student's stance with a small adjustment of the wrist. "Balance first," he said calmly. "Strength comes later." The student nodded, instantly understanding. Arnold noticed that too. Around them, time felt slower. There was no rush, no pressure, just repetition, patience, and quiet respect for the process. To anyone walking in from the outside, it would have looked unremarkable. No tension, no challenge, no hint of what was about to happen. That's what made the moment dangerous in its own way. Because the most powerful confrontations don't announce themselves. They don't start with raised voices or aggressive stares. They begin in calm spaces, where everyone feels safe enough to lower their guard. Arnold watched Chuck finish demonstrating a technique. The students bowed lightly and stepped back into position. Training resumed, as if nothing special were happening. But something subtle had shifted. Arnold wasn't impressed by speed. He wasn't impressed by force. What caught his attention was how little Chuck seemed to need either. Every motion had intention. Every pause had meaning. Arnold folded his arms loosely, studying, thinking. This wasn't about proving who was stronger. It wasn't about reputation or ego. It was about understanding a different kind of mastery. Around the dojo, students kept training, but their focus kept drifting back to the two men. Not because of fame, but because instinct told them something important was forming in the quiet. The room still felt calm, still felt normal, but just beneath the surface, the energy was changing. Why this matters: the most unforgettable moments don't explode into existence. They build quietly, until one small action turns calm into history. Arnold continued to watch from the edge of the mat, his eyes following Chuck Norris with focused curiosity. It wasn't admiration in the usual sense, and it certainly wasn't doubt. It was recognition. The awareness that he was witnessing a different language of strength. When he didn't speak fluently yet, Chuck finished demonstrating a technique and stepped back. The students bowed lightly, their movements synchronized, respectful. Training resumed in low voices and controlled motion. The room returned to its steady rhythm, but Arnold didn't look away. He replayed what he had just seen in his mind. No wasted energy, no unnecessary force. Chuck's movements were efficient, almost invisible. Where others relied on power, Chuck relied on timing. Where others pushed, he redirected. Arnold had built his life mastering physical dominance. Weights, endurance, control over muscle. He understood strength better than most men ever would. But what he was watching now wasn't muscle-driven. It was something deeper, something quieter. Without realizing it, Arnold smiled. It was subtle. Just a small lift at the corner of his mouth. Not a challenge, not sarcasm. A thoughtful smile. The kind that appears when curiosity meets respect. A student nearby noticed. Then, another. Whispers didn't start, but attention shifted. Training slowed slightly as eyes drifted toward Arnold and then back to Chuck. People could feel something forming, even if they couldn't name it. Chuck noticed too. He didn't react immediately. He simply met Arnold's eyes for a brief moment. No stare. Down. No tension. Just acknowledgement. The smile didn't disappear. Arnold stepped forward, crossing the edge of the mat with calm confidence. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He didn't carry himself like a visitor. He carried himself like someone who understood discipline, even if it came from a different world. "Mind if I try that?" Arnold asked, his tone casual but respectful. The room changed instantly. It wasn't dramatic. No gasp, no sudden noise, just a shift, like the air tightening slightly. A few students froze mid-motion. An instructor paused, uncertain whether to step in or step back. This wasn't a challenge, but it wasn't nothing either. Chuck studied Arnold for a moment, not sizing him up, not measuring ego, just observing, reading posture, breathing, intention. Then Chuck smiled back. "Of course," he said simply. That single word carried weight. Arnold stepped fully onto the mat. The soft surface compressed under his feet. He rolled his shoulders once, loosening them. Not in preparation for a fight, but for movement. The students formed a loose semicircle without being told. Not to watch a spectacle, but because instinct told them this mattered. Two different worlds stood facing each other. Arnold represented raw physical excellence, discipline forged in repetition, pain, and willpower. A man who had conquered limits by pushing through them. Chuck represented something else, effortless control, forged through patience, timing, and restraint. A man who didn't push against limits, but moved around them. Neither man looked tense. Neither looked eager to dominate. And that made everyone else uneasy. Because when ego steps into a room, it's loud. When mastery steps in, it's quiet. Chuck gestured lightly with his hand. "Whenever you're ready," Arnold nodded, his smile fading into focus. The dojo fell silent, not because someone demanded it, but because no one wanted to miss what came next. Breathing slowed. Footsteps stopped. Even the air seemed to wait. This wasn't about winning. It was about discovery. If you were standing there, would you feel disappointed not to see a fight, or grateful to witness control? And Arnold stood on the mat, feet shoulder-width apart, posture relaxed but ready. Years of discipline showed in the way he carried himself. Balanced, controlled, aware of his body and space. This wasn't a man pretending to be confident. This was confidence earned the hard way. Across from him, Chuck Norris looked almost effortless by comparison. His stance was neutral, unassuming, no dramatic pose, no visible tension. His hands rested naturally at his sides, his weight evenly distributed. To the untrained eye, he might have seemed casual. But the experienced students knew better. They had seen that posture before. It was readiness without urgency, control without stiffness. Arnold inhaled slowly, then exhaled. He wasn't nervous, but he was aware. Aware that this space operated under different rules. In the gym, power ruled. On the stage, presence ruled. But here, on the mat, precision ruled. And precision didn't care how strong you were. For a brief moment, Arnold's mind flickered with instinct. The old habits, the drive to test limits, to push forward and see what broke first. That instinct had carried him far in life. But it didn't belong here. He pushed it aside. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about learning. Chuck watched Arnold closely, not his arms or shoulders, but his breathing. The subtle shift of weight from heel to toe, the tension that appeared for just a fraction of a second before Arnold even moved. Chuck wasn't judging. He was listening. The room felt different now. The calm from earlier had transformed into focus. No one whispered. No one moved. Even the instructors had stepped back, trusting the moment to unfold on its own. This was where ego usually made its entrance. Most men, when placed in front of someone with a reputation like Chuck's, either overcompensated or hesitated. They tried to dominate or froze under pressure. Arnold did neither. He stood still. That choice alone spoke volumes. Chuck gave a small nod, not approval, not encouragement. Recognition. The unspoken understanding passed between them. This will be clean. This will be controlled. This will be respectful. Arnold shifted his stance slightly, testing the mat beneath his feet. He didn't rush. He didn't attack. He waited for alignment, body, breath, intention. Time stretched. For the students watching, it felt like more than a few seconds. This pause held weight. It revealed something most people never see. The space before action, where decisions are made. And that space separates fighters from masters. Arnold realized something in that moment. Strength had always been about effort for him. About adding more weight, more reps, more intensity. But Chuck's stillness suggested the opposite. Less movement, less resistance, less force. That idea challenged him more than any opponent ever had. Chuck spoke quietly, breaking the silence. Take your time. Not a command, not a warning, an invitation. Arnold nodded again, a faint smile returning, not of amusement, but appreciation. He felt no pressure to rush, no need to impress. The ego that once drove him had stepped back. Around them, the students leaned forward slightly, without realizing it. They weren't waiting for a strike. They were waiting for understanding. Because something rare was happening. Two men who could easily dominate a room were choosing restraint instead. This was the real confrontation. Not physical, but internal. Arnold versus impulse. Power versus patience, habit versus awareness. And in that quiet tension, something shifted. Arnold finally moved. Not explosively, not aggressively. Just a clean, committed step forward, guided by intention rather than force. Chuck's eyes sharpened. Not in alarm, but in focus. This was it, where ego would either surface or disappear. Psychological insight. Most people think control comes from strength. In reality, control comes from letting go of the need to prove anything. The room held its breath. 7 seconds were about to begin. Arnold's movement was smooth, deliberate, and committed. He didn't lunge or rush forward. He stepped in with purpose, weight shifting cleanly from back foot to front, testing distance rather than forcing contact. It was the kind of motion that came from experience, not impulse. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. That second felt heavy. Then Chuck moved, not faster than Arnold. Earlier, he read the intention before the action fully formed. A subtle turn of Arnold's shoulder, a slight tightening in his grip, a breath taken just a beat too deep. Those signals were enough. Chuck stepped off the line, just inches, not away. Around, Arnold felt it instantly. The resistance he expected wasn't there. His forward momentum met empty space. In that same breath, Chuck's hand guided Arnold's arm, not with force, but with direction. The contact was light, almost polite, but the effect was immediate. Arnold's balance shifted. Not dramatically, not violently, just enough. Enough to make him aware. Enough to interrupt his center. The dojo disappeared. There was no crowd, no students, no sound. Only sensation. Arnold adjusted instinctively, engaging his core, trying to recover alignment. In any other environment, that adjustment would have worked. His strength was real, his control was earned. But Chuck was already ahead of the correction. A small pivot of the hips, a slight turn of the wrist, a controlled step, each movement fed into the next, like a sentence spoken in a language Arnold didn't fully understand yet, but was beginning to hear. The 7 seconds stretched. To the observers, it looked simple, almost underwhelming. No slam, no strike, no aggression, just two bodies moving, and one guiding the other. Arnold felt the mat beneath his feet compress unevenly. His weight wasn't where he wanted anymore. He wasn't falling, but he wasn't stable either. That realization landed harder than any impact, because instability meant vulnerability. Chuck stopped. Just like that, he didn't finish the motion, didn't escalate, didn't take advantage. He released Arnold's arm and stepped back, giving him his space. The 7 seconds were over. Arnold stood upright, breathing steady, heart calm, but mind wide open. The dojo was silent, not the uncomfortable silence of embarrassment, the thoughtful silence of understanding. Arnold exhaled slowly and then laughed. Not loudly, not defensively, a quiet laugh of recognition. "Okay," he said, nodding. "I felt that." Chuck smiled, just slightly. "That's the point," he replied. Around them, no one spoke, no one moved. The students weren't looking at Arnold as a man who had been overpowered. They were looking at him as a man who had just learned something rare, and they were looking at Chuck with renewed clarity, because what they had witnessed wasn't dominance. It was permission. Permission to stop relying on force. Permission to value balance over aggression. Permission to understand that power doesn't need to announce itself. Arnold bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect, not submission. The 7 seconds had done their work. If you believe real strength is control, not ego, type respect in the comments. And Chuck stepped back fully now, creating clear space between them. His posture returned to neutral, hands relaxed, shoulders loose, breathing steady. There was no trace of tension left in him, as if nothing significant had happened at all. But the room knew better. The silence wasn't forced. It settled naturally. Like dust after movement, Arnold remained where he was, feet planted, eyes focused downward for a brief moment. He replayed the sensation in his body, the shift in balance, the ease with which control had been taken and then given back. There was no frustration in his expression, only curiosity. He looked up and met Chuck's eyes again. This time, the smile that crossed Arnold's face was different. It wasn't casual, it wasn't curious. It was grounded in respect. "That was clean," Arnold said quietly. Chuck nodded once. "Clean is safe," he replied. The words carried weight, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they reflected an entire philosophy. The idea that mastery wasn't about dominance. It was about responsibility, around them. The students remained frozen in place. No one checked their phones. No one whispered. Even the instructors stood still, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. Moments like this were rare. Most demonstrations ended with applause or commentary. This one ended with understanding. Chuck turned slightly toward the class. He didn't raise his voice. "What you just saw," he said, "wasn't speed or strength." He paused. It was timing. He stepped back onto the mat and gestured lightly with his hand, reenacting a fraction of the movement. Slow, clear, visible. "When someone commits their weight," he continued, "they give you information. You don't fight that information. You use it." Arnold watched closely now, not as a participant, but as a student. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Chuck glanced back at him briefly, acknowledging that change, then returned his attention to the room. "If you try to overpower someone," Chuck said, "you match force with force. That's exhausting, and it leaves you open." He demonstrated again, this time stopping mid-motion. "But if you control balance," he added, "you control the outcome." The students nodded, some slowly, some immediately, each of them absorbing the lesson in their own way. Arnold stepped back off the mat, giving the space back to the class. His earlier reaction had already spoken for him. Training resumed. But it wasn't the same. Movements became quieter. Footwork became more deliberate. Students paid attention not just to what they were doing, but why. The silence broke slowly, replaced not by noise, but by focus. Chuck walked past Arnold as he moved through the room. As he passed, Arnold spoke softly, so only Chuck could hear. "Thank you." Chuck stopped for a fraction of a second. "You were already ready," he replied. That simple sentence landed deeper than praise. It meant something else entirely. Readiness wasn't about strength. It was about humility. Arnold stood quietly at the edge again, arms relaxed at his sides. He wasn't watching to compare or judge anymore. He was watching to understand. The authority Chuck held in the room wasn't built on fear or reputation. It came from consistency, from clarity, from the trust that his control would never cross into ego. That was why the silence had followed him. Not because people were afraid to speak, but because they didn't want to waste the moment. Lesson clear and grounded. True authority doesn't demand attention. It earns it, by knowing when to act and when to stop. The dojo breathed again, but everyone knew they had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. The dojo slowly returned to motion, but it no longer felt like the same place. Training resumed. Partners realigned, drills restarted, but every movement carried more intention than before. It was as if the room itself had learned something. Arnold remained near the edge of the mat, watching quietly. He wasn't thinking about the moment as a contest or a comparison. There was no sense of loss, no bruised pride. What stayed with him was clarity, the kind that arrives when an old belief is gently replaced by a better one. He had spent decades mastering effort. What he had just witnessed was mastery of restraint. Chuck continued moving among the students, correcting posture, adjusting angles, reminding them to breathe. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that anything remarkable had occurred. And that, in itself, was the most telling detail. Great moments, Arnold realized, don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply pass through a room and leave it changed. One student, barely out of his teens, hesitated before stepping forward. "Sensei," he asked carefully, "was that a technique?" Chuck smiled faintly. "It was a principle," he replied. That answer stayed with everyone who heard it. A technique could be memorized. A principle had to be understood. Chuck went on, not lecturing, just speaking plainly. He explained how control begins with awareness, of space, of timing, of one's own intent. How strength, when used without awareness, creates resistance. And how resistance invites chaos. Arnold listened without interruption. He thought about the gyms he had trained in, the competitions he had dominated, the roles he had played on screen where power was loud and victory obvious. All of it had required force. This moment required none. When training finally paused, the students bowed, their respect deeper than routine. They didn't rush to talk. They didn't rush to ask questions. They absorbed. Arnold stepped forward once more, this time without stepping onto the mat. "I came here curious," he said. "I'm leaving informed." The room smiled, not at the words, but at the honesty behind them. Chuck nodded. That's how learning works. There was no photo, no announcement, no attempt to turn the moment into a story. But stories have a way of forming anyway. In the days that followed, the students talked, not about who was stronger, but about what they felt, about balance, about control, about how power could exist without aggression. Years later, some of them would say they remembered that day more clearly than any test or belt ceremony, because it taught them something: life, shaping, strength is loud, control is quiet, and discipline is what lasts. Arnold left the dojo changed in a way no workout had ever changed him. He didn't walk out feeling smaller. He walked out feeling sharper, more precise, more grounded. That was the real victory, not dominance, not display, but understanding. The dojo doors closed behind him, and training continued inside. Yet the echo of those 7 seconds stayed, moving beyond the walls, beyond the mats, into the mindset of everyone who had been there. Final moral, clear and powerful. The strongest person in the room isn't the one who wins. It's the one who doesn't need to. Have you ever seen a moment that felt small at first, but deep down, you knew something